Hi everybody, today is April 15th, Friday. This is Philosophy 1200, and today will be our last lecture on informal fallacies. So now we have all the fallacies on the table. We should be able to um, start pointing them out in real life and being able to do some of the practice problems. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm just going to take some of the problems from the sheet that's on Blackboard and talk about them, and hopefully it'll be illustrative. But yeah, today's the last day we're going to be dealing with fallacies. Going to be going back to proofs next week, so if you're still having trouble with fallacies, please reach out to me. I think compared to proofs, they're different. They have their own challenges, but I think all things considered, they're a bit easier to deal with. And yeah, they don't require any paper or anything like that. So just get familiar with the fallacies. You will be able to, have your notes with you when you take the last exam. So so long as you have a list of the fallacies and maybe you have a good idea of what each of them are, you should be in good shape. And hopefully today's lecture will help you further that goal. So I just did a whole copy paste from the exercises on Blackboard, and we're just going to go through them. We'll start with number 2 because number 1's done for us. Number 2 says it's a mistake because it is an error. Very simple one, and what jumps out to me is it's a mistake because it is an error. Well, what is a mistake? It is an error. What is an error? It is a mistake. So it is a mistake because it is an error. So this is an argument that justifies the conclusion with just a restatement of the conclusion. And what is that? That is begging the question. So number 2 is begging the question because the premise here, it's a mistake, or sorry, the conclusion, it's a mistake, is just a restatement of the premise, it is an error. As I think I might have said on the discussion board, begging the question a lot of times will not occur using the same words. A lot of times an author or a speaker will use a different word to beg the question. That's what makes it more elusive. That's why it's, I think, easy to commit when you are doing your own writing and argumentation. So yeah, number 2, begging the question. Number 3, over and over they're saying something like this. We don't know what the noise in the old house was, or the white shape in the photo, so it must be a ghost. So this seems to be a ghost tale, and the big clue here is this phrase, we don't know what the noise in the old house was. We don't know. And we don't know what the white shape in the photo was. Therefore, it must be a ghost. That is a carbon copy of the argument from ignorance. They don't know what the noise was. They don't know what the white shape was. So they infer that it must be a ghost. That is blatantly fallacious reasoning. There could be a number of other possibilities. The lack of evidence, the lack of knowledge about what caused those things does not lead us to believe that it was a ghost. So yeah, number 3, argument from ignorance. 4, either man was created just as the Bible tells us, or man evolved from inanimate chemicals and random chance. The clue here is this either or. We have one fallacy that exclusively deals with disjunctions, and when we see an either or, that should be our first thought. That fallacy is the false choice. So with that in mind, let's read it again and think about whether it is a false choice. Either man was created just as the Bible tells us, or man evolved from inanimate chemicals and random chance. So when examining the false choice, we have to think about, are there other possibilities than that? And I think that there are. There might be an intelligent design theory saying that, maybe our evolutionary ancestors were created from a divine being, and then we evolved from there. That's a possibility. So I think 4 is a false choice because both of these choices, both of these disjuncts, don't really give us the full range of plausible theories of the origin of man. So let's go to number 5. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals has filed multiple complaints, including alleged animal abuse, the misuse of drugs on horses, and fraud against trainer Steve Asmussen and his top assistant Scott Blassie. Clark Brewster, the attorney representing Asmussen and Blassie, said that he had not seen any of the complaints. Until I see the materials, it's hard to comment. It's obviously a piece completely out of context, slanted for the purposes of the organization that caused somebody to deceptively be hired by the Asmussen stable. Alright. Usually the longer one of these questions is, the harder it is to deal with, just because there's a lot of moving parts. So let's think about what the argument is about. So PETA is alleging animal abuse and other things, but the attorney doesn't really comment on the alleged animal abuse or the fraud or anything like that. He's just talking about PETA's motivations. Yeah. So like a good lawyer does, he doesn't have the materials, he can't comment on the allegations, so he's trying to change the subject. What happens, when that happens, that is a clue that it's the red herring fallacy. So I think for number 5, we could call it a red herring. Also, I'll just say this, it's totally possible that for some of these fallacies you might see something different and you might be able to give a good argument that it's a different fallacy than what I've pointed out. That's perfectly okay, I think, on most of the questions. If I give you a multiple choice question, it will not be ambiguous. If it's a short answer question, then I'll probably accept multiple answers, and I'll probably ask for justification too. So if you think that I'm wrong about any of these, or if you have an alternative interpretation, I would be happy to hear it. Please post it on the discussion board. These fallacies are hard for this sort of ambiguous reason, so more participation from you guys I think is a really good thing. So let's go to number 6. The fact that we receive so much feedback to the Wolf-Simpson paper suggests to us that science is proceeding as it should, the editor said in a statement. The study involved multiple techniques and lines of evidence, and the authors felt their conclusion was the most plausible explanation for these results when considered as a whole. We hope that the study and the subsequent exchange being published today will stimulate further experiments, whether they support or overturn this conclusion. Alright, so I hate this question, and that's because there's no fallacy here. As this exercises sheet points out, some of these questions may well have no fallacy. So yeah, this is just simply sort of a report. I don't see anything wrong with it. I'll tell you right now that on our exam, there will be every single question I give you about fallacies will have a fallacy in it. I think the fallacies are hard enough, and they just get unnecessarily harder when there's no fallacy to be found. So on this sheet there may well be a couple of them that have no fallacy, but know that those won't appear on the exam. Alright, go to number 7. It is the case that either the nobility of this country appear to be wealthy, in which case they can be taxed, or else they appear to be poor, in which case they are living frugally and must have immense savings, which can be taxed. So again, our eye should go to the either or, because we have one fallacy that deals exclusively with either or statements. And I think that whenever we see a disjunction like that, we should consider the false choice fallacy. So in order to do that, we ask ourselves, does this argument reasonably consider the plausible possibilities? Is it being charitable to the possibilities? Well, both sides of the disjunct lead to the belief that the nobility should be taxed. So that tells us that the author might have a certain bias or a certain agenda that they might be using when they state this argument. So we have to consider, is there a possibility where the nobility do not deserve to be taxed? And I think that we can see that. I don't really know how nobility works, but I think it's possible to consider that maybe there's some, lowly member of the nobility who doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't have a lot of wealth, and therefore shouldn't be taxed, or maybe shouldn't be taxed at as high a level. And that's really all we need to say that this is a false choice fallacy. There is a not far off scenario that is not reflected by this disjunction. So I think number 7 is a false choice. Number 8, I don't like spinach, and I'm glad I don't, because if I liked it, I'd eat it, and I just hate it. So this is kind of odd, and you can spend a lot of time tripping your mind up about it, but it's odd because it's sort of tautologist. I either like it or I don't. If I did like it, then I'd eat it. If I did like it, then I'd like it. We notice that a statement like this doesn't really say anything meaningful, despite being so simple. And that should clue us in that it might be begging the question. And I think it's begging the question because if I'd like it, then I'd eat it, and I just hate it. Well, his conclusion is that he doesn't like spinach, and his justification for not liking spinach is him not liking spinach. I hate it, don't like. Those aren't perfect synonyms, but they're close enough for us to say, well, that's begging the question. He's not really giving us justification for not liking spinach, which is fine, but in this context, it's not a good argument. All right. Number 9, I often read the Mexico enablers justify the 800,000 Mexicans illegally crossing the U.S. border every year, rationalizing this with a statement such as, well, it is either they stay in Mexico or starve or risk their lives crossing the border. So this has a lot going on in it. But notice this part in quotes. And in there we have a disjunction. We have an either or statement. So again, whenever we see an either or, we should think about the false choice. Well, it is either they stay in Mexico and starve or risk their lives crossing the border. So we ask, does that accurately represent all of the, the close possibilities of the scenario? And I don't think it does. While there may be risks for these people staying in Mexico, starvation might not be the only risk. There might be other risks to staying in Mexico. That necessarily makes it a false choice. They might have other choices than crossing the border. That makes it a false choice. So even though this is a sort of complex thing where we have a quote within a quote, it's really the quote and the disjunction that makes it a false choice. There may be another fallacy here, but on the face of it, I don't really see it. So number 10, to be an atheist, you have to believe with absolute certainty that there is no God. In order to convince yourself with absolute certainty, you must examine all the universe and all the places where God could possibly be. Since you obviously haven't, your position is indefensible. So this is an interesting argument. I think with this, my mind jumps to this first sentence. So to be an atheist, you must believe with absolute certainty that there is no God. That's a very bold claim, and a claim that I think most atheists would not abide by. To my knowledge, many atheists are agnostic atheists, where they take no sort of position of knowledge to the existence of God. So if you sort of opt out of that epistemological question, it might just come down to simple belief, which doesn't require absolute certainty. And this argument relies on that absolute certainty, because absolute certainty of the existence of God is nearly impossible. Examining all the universe and all the places where God could possibly be is a very, very high standard. So this author does that to show that atheism under this characterization is untenable. So we have to ask, is this an accurate characterization of atheism and its position? And I think the answer is no. I think this is not how most atheists would characterize their position. And I don't think it's charitable to their position or their beliefs. That suggests to me that number 10 here is a straw man, where this author is straw manning the atheist position. They're characterizing it as much weaker and sort of internally contradictory than it actually may be. So yeah, I think number 10 is a straw man. 11. Near perfect correlations exist between the death rate in Hyderabad, India from 1911 to 1919, and variations in membership of the International Association of Machinists during the same period. So that's just talking about a random correlation. And when we see a correlation, our first thought should be post hoc ergo propter hoc. After it, therefore, because of it, also known as correlation does not equal causation. So what is this author trying to do? He's pointing out the correlation, but why? These two things seem entirely separate. So I think he might be implying a causal relationship. Near perfect correlations exist between the death rate and the membership of this thing. I'd like a little more from this example to be sure that he's making a sort of causal claim. But the fact that he cites the near perfect correlations, I think, is enough for us to think that he might be implying a causal relationship. And he really can't do that. Just because these two things correlates doesn't mean that they cause each other. And I think it's sort of weird that we would think that death rates and membership in a maybe a labor union or a professional organization would cause each other. That seems a little absurd without more evidence. So I think number 11 is a post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. All right, going to number 12. I hardly think that 58 is the right age at which to talk about a retirement home unless there is some serious health concerns. My 85-year-old mother power walks 2 miles each day, drives her car safely, climbs stairs, does crosswords, and reads the daily paper. All right, this is a great example. So this is the conclusion. I hardly think that 58 is the right age to talk about retirement home unless there are some serious health concerns. That's a conclusion. And what does the author use to justify that conclusion? A personal anecdote. Well, as I hope we would all know by now, a personal anecdote is not sufficient to justify a general claim. While it may be true that his 85-year-old mother is in awesome health, that doesn't mean that that's necessarily true for the majority of the population. So what this author is doing is committing the hasty generalization. They're taking their own personal experience with their mother and generalizing that to the entire population. They may be right about that. They may end up having a true sort of inference. Maybe her mother is representative of the population. But properly justifying that claim requires a lot more research and a lot more rigor than this author is putting in. So I think number 12 is the hasty generalization. All right. Going to 13. For the natives, they are near all dead of the smallpox, so as the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess. Good old John Winthrop. Talking about some pre-manifest destiny business, I guess. So what is he saying? It's always hard to philosophically evaluate older writings and documents because they used English funny. But what is he trying to say? So he's saying, okay, all the Native Americans are dead because of smallpox. Why did this happen? That's what the so implies. So as the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess. That, to me, I'm no historian these days, but that to me says that God sort of ordained that the colonists have this land. And that's why the natives are dying. It's sort of God's will that they die so that the colonists can take the land. So that seems to be the argument. What fallacy does that commit? Well, I would think post hoc ergo propter hoc. So John Winthrop we can characterize his argument in this way. Well, the colonists showed up, and then all the natives died. Therefore, it's God's will that the colonists have all the land, because otherwise the natives wouldn't have died when they got here. So that's a post hoc fallacy, because he's suggesting that the colonists' arrival and their godliness causes the death of the natives. Yeah. And I don't know. He's not too far off, because the arrival of the colonists did cause a lot of death and disease, but not, I think, because of divine intervention. That has a more material cause than John Winthrop would suggest. So he's, falsely saying that, well, we showed up here, we want the land, the people are dying, therefore, God has caused this, or it is preordained that this happened. That's a post hoc fallacy, and this, it's a hard question, but yeah, I would go with the post hoc fallacy. Number 14. Information is what you need to make money short term. Knowledge is the deeper understanding of how things work. It's obtained only by long and an efficient study. It's gained by those who set aside the profit motive and instead possess an intrinsic desire just to know. Good old David Brooks, always moralizing. So I don't really see a fallacy here. David Brooks is known to commit them from now and then, but I think this is just his typical moralizing. So yeah, I mean, take or leave it, the argument. But I see nothing in terms of an informal fallacy wrong with it. So that tells you that this example will not appear on an exam. Alright, 15. He's not a moron at all. He's my friend. My personal relations with the president are extremely good. Former Canadian Prime Minister. So what is he saying? He's not a moron at all. He's a friend. My personal relations with the president are extremely good. So notice that this whole part of the sentence is about them being friends in their personal relationship. Whereas this part of the sentence is about whether or not someone is a moron. So it seems that this answer was prompted because they were asked, is the president a moron? And that's itself a loaded question that a good politician would never in their right mind answer. So a good politician would sort of swerve it and say, well, he's not a moron, he's my friend. Doesn't want to talk about whether or not the president is a moron, because that's not really a winning argument. So the Canadian Prime Minister here is changing the conversation to talk about their friendship. And what happens when that happens? That is a red herring fallacy. So it's, the press might want him to talk about whether or not the president's a moron, but the Canadian Prime Minister changes it to talk about his friendship with the president. Red herring fallacy. Alright, number 16. Why opium produces sleep? Because there is in it a dormitive power. Alright. So why opium produces sleep? That's the conclusion. Because there is in it a dormitive power. What does that mean? Dormitive, I think of like dormitory, a place where you like live and maybe sleep. So both this premise and the conclusion are about similar things. I think our best guess here, without having a dictionary to look up what dormitive means, would be that it's begging the question. So why does it produce sleep? Well, because there is in it a sleepy power. That seems to be what this is saying. And that's completely arguing in a circle, and that tells us that it's begging the question. So 16, I would think, is begging the question. All right, this is the last sheet that I'll be doing today. So 17, my opponent wants to sever the Danish church from the state for his own personal sake. His motion is an attempt to take over the church and further his ecumenical theology by his usual mafia methods. My eye goes to this second sentence. So he wants to sever this Danish church from the state for his own personal sake. And why does he want to do this? Because he has this ecumenical theology and mafia methods. What this guy is talking about is, or it might be a woman, what this person is talking about is not why or why not the church should separate from the state, but why the person leading the opposition is a bad guy. So that tells us that we're probably dealing with an ad hominem fallacy. So then we have to think about what kind of ad hominem fallacy it is. Well, to me, it looks like they're attacking him straight up, saying that his position is just an attempt to take over the church, further his theology by usual mafia methods. That suggests that he's a bad guy doing bad things. That tells me it's probably the ad hominem abusive fallacy. And that's what I'd go with for number 17. Number 18, I do not have much information on this case except that the general statement of the agency that there is nothing in the files to disprove his communist connections. This is some McCarthyism. And clue your eyes on this. There is nothing in the files to disprove his communist connections. Well, this is how McCarthyism works. You just raise suspicion in people as a means of collecting power. There is nothing in the files to disprove his communist connections. That's the argument from ignorance. So there's nothing to disprove that this person is not a communist. Therefore, they might be a communist, or they are a communist. We don't know. That is completely the argument from ignorance, and that's how Joe McCarthy made himself famous. Really dangerous stuff. And I think that's actually a really good example of why we need to be vigilant of arguments like this, because they can cause a lot of damage in people's lives as well as our civic discourse. So, number 18th, argument from ignorance. Number 19, we took the Bible and prayer out of public schools, and now we're having weekly shootings practically. We had the 60s sexual revolution, and now people are dying of AIDS. Oh, Christine O'Donnell. Man, what's a throwback. Y'all should look her up if you got the time. Those were wild political days. So, what is she saying here? We took the Bible and prayers out of public schools, and now we're having shootings. And then we had the sexual revolution, and now people are dying of AIDS. So my thought with this would be sort of one or two things. I would either go with the post hoc, ergo propter hoc fallacy, because she seems to be implying that taking Bible and prayer out of public schools leads to school shootings. Same thing with the sexual revolution. Now people have AIDS. that is making a causal connection that we can't really prove. But I think also the slippery slope might be appropriate too. Because the Bible in Pareata Public Schools is so far off from having weekly shootings. I might want more evidence to know for sure whether it's a slippery slope fallacy, but I think either one would be appropriate for this question. All right. In many ways, the process reflects the history of the Capitol and the nation, said Mr. Ritchie, the historian. The Capitol building is an interesting conglomeration, he said. It is a whole series of buildings put together at different times, and in that way it is a nice reflection of American democracy, which was put together piecemeal from a lot of different materials. It reflects one motto of our nation, e pluribus unum, Latin for out of many, one. So my first thought would be to maybe look for a composition or a division fallacy, because they're talking about different materials and things being put together, but I don't think that there's a fallacy here. So another question that definitely won't appear on the exam. So 21, how is education supposed to make me feel smarter? Besides, every time I learn something new, it pushes some old stuff out of my brain. Remember when I took that home winemaking course and forgot how to drive? Good old Homer Simpson. So, I think his conclusion is this. Every time I learn something new, it pushes some old stuff out of my brain. And how does he justify that? He justifies that by pointing to the time he took a home winemaking course and then forgot how to drive. Well, that's just one time. And considering it's Homer Simpson, we might be willing to take him at his word that he forgot how to drive. But just because that happened the one time doesn't mean that every time he learns something new, it pushes some old stuff out of his brain. I mean, chances are that even Homer Simpson learns something new every day. So I think this might be the hasty generalization fallacy, because he's taking this one time, this one example, and generalizing it to his whole educational outlook. That is, I think, inappropriate in this case. All right, number 22. The community of Pacific Palisades is extremely wealthy. Therefore, every person living there is extremely wealthy. Well, that's very simple. That's either going to be the fallacy of composition or division. And I still get these confused, so an open note test will be pretty helpful here. But what are they saying? They're saying that the whole, the community, is extremely wealthy. Therefore, the parts, every person living there, is extremely wealthy. So I believe that's the fallacy of division. And that's a fallacy because the community may well be extremely wealthy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every person living there is extremely wealthy. There could be a couple outliers who aren't very wealthy, or there could be, a couple people who are so wealthy that they sort of compensate for the people who aren't. We can't imply that everyone there is extremely wealthy just because the community is. All right, number 23. Dear friend, a man who has studied law to its highest degree is a brilliant lawyer, for a brilliant lawyer has studied the law to the highest degree. Yeah, it's a little weird. But yeah, I think it's begging the question. If we notice, between the red brackets are exactly the same words, just flip-flopped. So a man who has studied law to the highest degree is a brilliant lawyer. Why? Because a brilliant lawyer has studied the law to the highest degree. That's not justification. That is just arguing in a circle. A, therefore A. So 23, straight up begging the question. 24. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. Very popular Supreme Court opinion. stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. Okay, this one is a bit of a weird example, and it might. I don't really like this problem for that reason. So I believe in this court opinion, they end up deciding that free speech protections don't apply in some cases, like shouting fire in a theater, falsely shouting fire in a theater, like that's not covered under free speech. So I think this argument might be directed at somebody committing the fallacy of accident. So if someone was on trial for saying or for shouting fire, falsely shouting fire in a theater, plenty of people would say, well, that's just their First Amendment right. They have free speech. You're allowed to say whatever you want, no matter what. So why are they being arrested or charged with something like this? Well, I think the person who gives that argument is committing the fallacy of accident. They're suggesting that there is no possible exception to the First Amendment. And, that I think may well be a defensible constitutional position, depending on how you do your political and legal philosophy. But the court system has pretty much decided that there are reasonable exceptions to the First Amendment. So to think that there aren't would be to commit the fallacy of accident. That's not super clear given this example, but I believe that's the context needed in order to make sense of it. So again, I don't really love this this question here, but if we flesh it, if the author were to flesh it out a bit more, we would see that it's the fallacy of accident. 25. Musical chills are known as aesthetic chills, thrills, shivers, and involve a seconds-long feeling of goosebumps and tingling. The emotions evoked by beautiful music stimulate the hypothalamus, which controls primal drives such as hunger, sex, and rage, and also involuntary responses like blushing and goosebumps. Interesting. That just seems to be a report of empirical evidence. I don't think there's a fallacy here. So yeah, another swing and a miss. On to 26 then, which will be our last one for today. I've been talking too long. 27 years ago, Luis Alvarez first proposed that the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction event was caused by an asteroid that struck the Earth 65.5 million years earlier. This meant that the dinosaurs died out 65,500,027 years ago. Yeah. This one's... I don't really see a fallacy here. I mean, I know in some books, and I I think in this book too, counts this as a fallacy, but for our purposes, it's not super significant. I think what's supposed to be drawn is this distinction between 65.5 million and this extra 27 here. That's a fallacy in some books. I don't think it's that important. So, yeah, as far as we're concerned, that's a no fallacy. Another swing and a miss. I apologize for that. But I think just through these examples alone, we've seen a lot of good cases of the fallacies and how they can be applied. Again, I'm sure that plenty of you guys were thinking something else when I gave my answers. So if you think you have a good argument for that, if you really think that one of these commits an ad hominem fallacy or something like that, please post about it in the discussion board or send me an email about it. Yeah, I like to be sort of fluid with how we interpret these fallacies, because again, they're sort of hard to track down in a lot of cases. So, but I think on the main sheet there's 20 more examples. So please tackle those. There's a chance that some of them will appear on the exam, so it'll be good to be sort of familiar with them. And yeah, reach out to me if you have more questions, and we'll start doing more proofs next week. So thank you for your time.